Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 plus 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows. My name is Armen Zakharian. Hello and welcome to our literary channel Read Less, a home of letters, a place where we speak about texts and more. And today we'll talk about George Orwell's 1984, one of the most recognized and influential books of the previous century. Through a compelling personal history of resistance and struggle of an individual, Orwell shows in his novel how a cruel, totalitarian regime might function. The story is set in near future, in a world carved into endless war and absolute control. At its heart is Winston Smith, an ordinary man with an extraordinary problem. He still remembers how to think for himself. Working at the Ministry of Truth, his job is to rewrite the past so it matches the party's ever-changing line. But in secret, he keeps a diary, falls in love, and dreams of freedom. Small acts of rebellion that, in the novel, are punishable by torture and death. But what makes 1984 so powerful is not just the bleakness of its vision, but its form, its language, and style. So today I want to speak about Big Brother's greatest trick, of how this book really grabs your attention, how the world of the novel is introduced, and why its opening is widely considered one of the best in the history of modern literature. And soon you'll find out that it is all really about time and timing. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. That is the opening line of the novel, and at first glance, you might think that it is quite straightforward, that there is nothing special about it. However, if you dig into it, you'll find that this is a perfect intertextual lasagna, a paella mista of all kinds of references, periphrases, and allusions, a dark plum cake, brilliant example of how semantically dense a text can be and what plenty of meanings it can carry. So let's try to figure out why. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Shall we start with the clocks? Firstly, properly behaving clocks are not supposed to strike 13. Usually and normally, most clocks strike no more than 12 times, at noon and midnight. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon or in the morning, they would strike only once. The clocks striking 13 is something that cannot or should not happen. This sentence alludes to a children's riddle. What time is it when the clock strikes 13? It's time to get a new clock. Thus, this detail immediately makes it clear that something is wrong in the world we're into. Something is broken and should be fixed. Secondly, you've probably noticed the plural form of the word clock. Orwell emphasizes that the clocks were striking 13. Not just one broken or weird clock was misbehaving, but all of the clocks around. It indicates that the problem doesn't concern the clocks themselves, but the whole system that makes them strike, that sets the time. On the other hand, what the system clearly can do is to unite, or better said, to unify, to ensure that all the clocks will show the same time, allowing no exceptions. Thus, from the very beginning, even before readers understand that the novel is set in a totalitarian society, if the book's cover wasn't enough of a clue, they may notice that all the clocks striking wrong, not the way they should, however, do it unanimously, with one voice only, and with no deviations from the correct party line. And it's not just the clocks. The time itself is used to give the reader a taste of totalitarian hospitality. The novel begins at 13 o'clock. It is an unusual representation of time in literature. It had never been widely used until the 20th century. Time was usually divided into, let's say, halves. 12 hours before noon and 12 hours after. And if we pay attention to the representation of time in literature, we'll easily notice that, for example, our dear and kind Mr. Pickwick, obviously from Dickens' Pickwick Papers, leaves the jail not at 15 o'clock, but at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Or when the brave traveler and truth-teller Gulliver, Jonathan Swift's beloved creature, is washed ashore on the island of Lilliput for the first time, he says, "I walked near a mile before I got to the shore, which I reached about 8 o'clock in the evening." 8 in the evening, not 20 o'clock. And vice versa. The usage of this military time, called so because in the early 20th century it was the military that adopted it faster and more eagerly than anyone else, the usage of this format in Orwell's novel is constant and intentional. And of course, it's not a coincidence that in the totalitarian state where war fever is the most common of diseases, everyone lives by military time. More accurate and less human. Well, so far we have been talking about the clocks. Now let's switch to the calendar. Why does the novel start on a bright cold day in April? Firstly, because April is a borderline. The spring is already here, nature awakes from its wintry sleep, and its revival begins. Yet, April can swing back to night frosts, late snowfall, heavy rain, and enchain the spring that will have only a dim hope of liberation. This ambivalence is a symbolic prologue to the story of the main character, who rebels against the totalitarian system just like spring against winter in April. Secondly, Orwell was not the first writer who noticed this peculiar nature of April. There was an important take on April made just several decades before Orwell's novel was written. One of the most significant texts of the 20th century, the poem The Waste Land, written by Thomas Stearns Eliot, opens with the following line: "April is the cruelest month." That is the April where Orwell's novel begins. Not the bright cold April of 1984 really, but the April of the Waste Land, the April that is the cruelest one. But we know, don't we, that almost every line of Eliot's poem is an allusion to some other text. He's playing with his reader and his predecessors an intertextual game. So let's see where Eliot's April comes from. If we dig deep enough, we'll see that it comes from the 14th century, and again from the first line. Chaucer's famous Canterbury Tales open with the following lines: "When in April the sweet showers fall, and pierce the drought of March to the root and all." So, it turns out that Chaucer begins the Canterbury Tales in April. Eliot steals it in a good postmodern manner, and Orwell follows this line by starting his novel in April, referring to the great texts of British literature. And his April does not begin in the first line, but 6 centuries before it. We could stop here, because in my view it's enough already to answer why Orwell's opening is so catchy and deep. But still, there's another touching detail. Orwell's first wife died at the very end of March, and her funeral was in April. She was buried in Newcastle at St. Andrew's and Jesmond Cemetery on April 3rd. And Winston Smith begins his diary on the very next day, writing down April 4th, 1984. For whom it suddenly occurred to him to wonder, was he writing this diary? For the future? For the unborn? His mind hovered for a moment around the doubtful date on the page, and then fetched up with a bump against the newspeak word, doublethink. For the first time, the magnitude of what he had undertaken came home to him. How could you communicate with the future? It was of its nature impossible. Either the future would resemble the present, in which case it would not listen to him, or it would be different from it, and his predicament would be meaningless. Well, the truth, as it often happens, was somewhere in between. The future does not yet resemble the past that Winston wrote of. However, in many places around the globe, it is not that different for his predicament to be meaningless to us. And even now, years later, it is still worth reminding ourselves and repeating that war is not peace, freedom is not slavery, and ignorance is not strength. Thank you for being with us today. If this episode made you feel the desire to read or reread Orwell, then it did its job. Please do the old world ritual of liking, subscribing, and maybe even commenting. It helps this small corner of thought make its steps in this rarely calm world of today. And for now, call me Armin, and I'll see you next time.